Okay, thank you guys for tuning in. Next, we have Kshitij, who is going to teach us about taming chaos with automation. And I think I'm really excited about this one just because as a data professional, we need so much automation just to be able to do our job well, let alone like great. So Kshitij, the floor is yours. I'm really excited for it. Thank you.
Thanks for the intro, Parker. Yeah, and hello everyone who is on the call. So this is actually like my first presentation that I'm doing, so slightly nervous on that. We'll see how it goes. I think that I have a good deck, but let's see. Very quickly, this is I changed the title a bit, but it's Data Change Management Lessons Learned at Vouch. And I guess let's kind of go to the next slide. So who am I? I am Kshitij. I am the Senior Analytics Engineer at Vouch, and I am a dbt power user, if you will. There's these links to social media on LinkedIn, and I'm sometimes active on Twitter. So let's kind of go to the next slide here. So the agenda for today is going to be sort of like three things. The first one is going to be an overview of like what is Vouch and what does data at Vouch look like, and what do the problems around data at Vouch look like, and some of the things we've done to kind of like think about how to solve them. The second one is kind of this framework we've started using at Vouch called change management, which is pretty common across a lot of different industries. There's like a whole consulting specialization around change management. So it's basically just like what is change management, why it's important to sort of manage your changes in a systematic process, and like how we use that manually to ease some of our pain points and avoid some confusion. And then the last thing we'll talk on is like how you can automate some of that change management. Like there's a bunch of repetitive stuff that you have to do as part of your checklists and change management process, and like thinking about how we can automate some of that and kind of where we're going with that. So that's the agenda for today. So very quickly, data at Vouch. So Vouch is a tech-enabled business insurance for startups. So we sell startups often their first policy, which is business owner's policy, and then kind of like we try to grow with them and offer them insurance as their business grows. Vouch itself is a Series C 200 employee company. And I think the thing to realize about why it's exciting to work on data at Vouch is because insurance is fundamentally a data business. And it's critical, like our product in a lot of ways is data. It's risk data, but it is data. And I think the other thing I'll also mention here on this slide is that we don't really deal with big data per se as it's traditionally defined in that we like a lot of B2C direct to consumer kind of companies where they have like a lot of events, but essentially for us, each event is a lot higher, has a much higher value, has a lot more signal. And so that's kind of something to also keep in mind, is that we're not doing big data, but our data is very complex and messy. Sometimes I describe insurance as a business as like a deck of Yu-Gi-Oh cards, and there's basically a lot of different combinations you can activate. And so it is a very complex data, more so in like the quality of the data than the quantity, if that makes sense. The next way to look at it is that data at Vouch. So the team has grown a lot. I joined roughly 11 months ago, and at the time it was like 3 of us. And so now it's like, I think 4 of us. And so now it's like exciting to see that it's grown. So there's kind of 3 different tiers of data at Vouch. There's the data engineers, whose job is to figure out how to bring data into our data warehouse, which is Snowflake. And kind of run some processes around entity resolution and uh, and summarization of like different facts from different sources, stuff like that. In the middle, we have the analytics engineers, which is what I do, which is the kind of the glue between the data engineers and the next section, which is the analysts. And so the analysts are really they're embedded in different lines of the business, and they're essentially trying like using a lot of like mode reports and dashboarding tools to essentially figure out what happened in the business, why it happened in the business. And like as analytics engineer, we're kind of the glue where we're essentially responsible for data modeling in DBT and creating the models that the analysts can use while at the same time kind of also leveraging what data engineering provides to us. Another way to look at it is this is the commits on our warehouse that I pulled earlier this week. So you can kind of see that we have 10 authors on our data warehouse committing in the last month. And so that's 58 commits, 184 files changed, and then there's like 2,000 additions, 3,000 deletions. And so we are basically averaging like 2 commits a day, roughly, excluding weekends. And that, I mean, it doesn't sound like a lot for a software team, but it's a lot for a data team. And below is kind of like a zoomed out version of what our DAG looks like. Keep the orange ones in mind. Those are exposures. Those actually don't live in DBT, but they live in mode. So the next one. So very quickly running through our high level architecture, this is what it looks like. So you have tools like Zendesk and Salesforce, and we bring those in through Stitch into Snowflake. There's Vouch internal data from our application system. We bring that in via Airflow into Snowflake again. Then we run DBT and Airflow to transform those raw tables into like your staging tables, intermediate tables, FactDim tables, and then kind of the final part of that is those tables are then consumed by Census up here, and then also like mode, and then there's some Airflow that we're starting to do around machine learning that consumes these Snowflake tables. And so I guess the thing to take away from this slide is that there's a lot of different places that we use the data warehouse across the company, and it's kind of scary sometimes to make a change just because of the vast surface area, not necessarily because of the vast data volume. So kind of then what we use is a process called change management in order to make changes safely. And why it's important is that it speeds up the team by reducing ambiguity around changes. So like if you document what the changes should be, especially larger ones that are probably like error prone and tedious, then essentially like anyone on the team can do it, but also like there's less ambiguity, so you can move through it faster. We add checks into this process, so like it increases confidence that the change will work as intended and won't have some nasty side effects. And then the last thing is also like it helps us share knowledge and reduce working in silo. And this kind of goes back to the previous slide. If we kind of use a change management process, then the 3 different job functions like the data engineers, analytics engineers, and analysts can kind of agree on a shared definition of like what a certain process looks like. And I think that's important so that you can go in and debug and understand a different part of the stack. Cool. So that's why change management is important. These are the first set of change management techniques we use at Vouch. They're manual, but I prefer to call them artisanal change management techniques. And the first one is essentially identify the boundaries of your change, right? Like, in other words, like what can you control versus what can you not control, right? And that's kind of inter-system versus intra-system. So an example of an inter-system one is if there is a new accepted value in a certain field in Salesforce, like you cannot really control that, and you have to like fix you have to fix your tests if you have an accepted values test there, or get rid of the tests, etc. And then the next part is intra-system, which is which parts of your system change more frequently than others and how you want to manage change there. A good example of this might be like your company goals, which you might put in a seed file, for instance, that changes like every quarter, even though the logic for how that's parsed might not change that regularly. And also like which parts are more brittle than others. So at Vouch, we found that relationship tests were really brittle because a lot of times you would get these like weird off by one errors just because the tables got loaded into Snowflake at different times. So we ended up deprecating relationship tests entirely, but like identifying the change boundaries kind of helped us figure out that this was something we didn't want in our change management process, for instance. The next one is document standard operating procedures, right? Like this is what you do regularly on a day-to-day basis, and this can be your ops tasks, right? This can be on call. This can be a bunch of other things, like how you handle communication with different teams. And so I'll give you an example here, which is how we version DBT models, and we use a scheme called calendar versioning, Calver, which is kind of popular with some other open source projects. So essentially, we create a new DBT model that's like DimX 2022, and we'll actually use the full date, but just for simplicity here, I'll kind of just use DimX 2022. Then we kind of migrate all the downstream dependencies of this migrate all the dependencies of the previous version, which is DimX 2021 to DimX 2022, and then kind of validate that there are no other dependencies on DimX 2021, and then kind of deprecate that table, and then kind of repeat that process. And that's kind of how like we iterate on models without breaking criticals like business reports that may depend on a given model. The next thing is invest heavily in onboarding. So there's two ways to do this. One thing that we found really useful in order to speed up and increase shared context across the team is to maintain a list of resources, both internal around how the company works, what's the role of the team within the company, etc., and also external, like what are the tools, what's happening in the greater market, right? And so there's documents, for instance, at Vouch comparing us to like our competitors, or essentially what the market outlook is for the rest of the insurance industry, stuff like that. And then also like set aside time to support new members synchronously, because, and I like to think of this as kind of like office hours, where our team has office hours for the greater company, but we also do set up more time when there's a new member of our team, just because they might need a bit more support initially to get going. And two resources we like here is the DBT fundamentals course, which everyone can go and do. And then I created an internal set of videos around how to set up your environment for analysts. That's kind of like the minimal version of your environment, which is like setting up VS Code and Git and how to create a pull request and make sure that your change is good in CI and then merge it, stuff like that. The last thing I'd say is like, if you have the time for it, set aside time for hackathons and tech debt cleanup, because these things are pretty easy to deprioritize and they're not always like there's always something more important that comes up. And on our team, on the data team, we found that the week after a break, so like after New Year's or after a summer break or something, works best. And there are two variations of this. Like we do a hackathon week once a year, which is great for experimentation. Like if you have an idea that's out there, it's a great time to go explore that idea. And then we also have a tech debt week, which is kind of just a great time to follow the life cycle process I outlined earlier around like clean up old models, like improve documentation. But this one comes with a bit of asterisk because we did this recently, and it's a system stress test, and it may require increased on-call resources just to make sure that the changes are good. Cool. So those were the manual ones. Now let's kind of move into the next phase, which is the automated ones. And why would you automate some of the process, right? One is that a lot of it is pretty tedious and error prone. And so the more you can automate, the better. Things run faster, things run more correctly. People are happy because they don't have to do quote unquote boring stuff, right? So that's one thing. So again, why invest in automation, right? And this is kind of like this green merge pull request is kind of a metaphor for it, where essentially a lot of changes on our CI pipelines, we want to get to the point where essentially if you see the button is green, you should be confident that your change will just work. And you don't really have to think about a bunch of other stuff, right? And so why invest? It's more comprehensive. Like we're all human, we can only check so many things at once. So having a machine check through hundreds versus the tens we might go through, it just leads to greater confidence that there won't be a bug. It's not to say that you'll never ship a bug, but at the same time, you're at least not shipping an obvious bug is kind of the way I'd put it. The second thing is that it removes the ego from the review process, because no matter how much we say that the review process isn't personal, if somebody reviews your code and they leave 25 comments on it, it does feel a bit personal, right? And also similarly on the flip side, it is horrible to write 25 comments on a pull request review. And so what if instead of writing 25 of them, we focused on maybe like the 5 or 10 most important ones and kind of let automation do the rest? And the last part is speeds up the review cycle by making reviews async. And what this means is that a lot of times when I'm reviewing code, now I can basically just go and check for the logic. And if it looks good to me, I can basically approve the PR, and then all the CI checks that are running can either say, yeah, this change is good to go, or it's not. And if it's not, the person can kind of iterate on making them pass independently and merge it. Like I don't need to come back and review what they've done, which is really powerful because then I can just review things once or twice. Like I only need to review whenever there's a significant change in logic, not when there's a significant change in implementation details. Okay. The next thing we do at Vouch is isolated environments. And I think this is really important. So we have 3 sets of environments, basically. So you have the production environment, which is where all of our production DBT models and Snowflake tables live. There's a CI environment, and these ones put dots around them, dashes around them because they're ephemeral, which means that they get spun up and then they get torn down at the end of the CI run. So they're not really long-living environments. And each branch in GitHub gets its own CI. And I guess the reason I'm kind of like mentioning this is I think dbt Cloud gives you a lot of this for free, but we're using dbt Core. And so that's why we have to implement a lot of this on our own. And then the last one is developer environments. So like each developer has their own schema that they can go in and build models into. And this means that all of the changes are pretty much isolated from each other. So you never, like earlier at Vouch, we used to get into problems where if you had two PRs running submitted at once, like, and they modified similar models, like one of them would change the model and then the other one would be like, yeah, this dependency doesn't look right. And so now they're isolated. So like there's no chance of that. And then also the developer ones are isolated. So essentially like I won't step on Jenna's toes or vice versa, etc. The next one is to abstract repeated error-prone logic into macros. One of a few of these ones we use is a null-aware date comparison, because when you try to compare dates and one of them is in null, it gets complicated. The next one is to pivot a JSON object into a table. So essentially, if you have an object type in Snowflake, it pivots it out into a table with the right types. And then the last one is the latest row per partition, which is like really, really useful for reverse ETL in, specifically, because for us, we want to like say, we want to find like what was the last application for a given customer or stuff like that. And so just getting like the latest event for by partition is useful there. And these ones are a bit complicated to write sometimes, which is why we've abstracted that logic into a macro. So we just write it once, and then essentially you can just use the macro and define the parameters there. And that means that even users who are not who aren't in the data modeling layer all day, like your analysts, can kind of contribute to a lot of this code. The next one we use is SQL Fluff to incorporate a consistent style guide. And we use this so that essentially we don't waste time nitpicking over style. We just let SQL Fluff run and do it and check for your style. And ultimately, if the style, if it passes, then the style is good. Then we don't have to argue about like trailing comma, leading comma, and a bunch of other stuff, right? Which is not super productive to debate every time. And then the next one is Slim CI. So Slim CI is a feature in dbt where you only run the models and tests that have changed. And we use this a lot in our CI pipeline for dbt core, because we, like, when you submit a change, we want to make sure that only whatever only whatever has changed is being run and tested, and not sort of the greater project. And that means that a lot of our it speeds up the build cycle a lot, because essentially our full dbt build takes about 40 minutes, but essentially you cannot wait 40 minutes for each change to happen. And that like really sucks, especially if somebody merges in a change before you and you kind of have to merge again and wait that 40 minutes again. So now the upper bound is about 10 minutes, but a lot of times if you're just modifying one or two tables, we can run in about 2 minutes or so. And so that means that like the time it takes for CI to run is kind of almost linearly proportional to the amount of models you're changing, which also means that if you do smaller PRs, which is something we highly, highly recommend, then your CI process moves a lot faster. So that's pretty useful. And then the next one is YAML check, which is an open source tool I wrote. And it checks that every column defined in YAML also exists in SQL. And we found this to be super useful for typos, where essentially a column is named like customer singular in your SQL, but then like customers plural in your YAML, or vice versa. And also just like that you're documenting things that exist. And it's also a great way to find documentation for models that no longer exist. Like you nuked the SQL file a while ago, but the YAML is still there. So yeah, that's YAML check. And funnily enough, JavaShop has a bug where there is a where this total order amount is defined in YAML, but not in SQL. And then the last, I think one of the last things is this automated DBT exposure generator. And we use this for mode models. So like each one of these is a mode model on the right-hand side. And this is important so that we know that if we change a model in DBT, or like remove it or so, we know that the downstream exposures in mode, in our case, won't break if that table is deleted. And that has kind of helped us a lot with the previous sort of like lifecycle update of DBT models, where we know if an exposure depends on a model, like we'll kind of change the exposure, like the mode report, and kind of wait for, so we run this process every hour, we'll wait for that dependency to change, and then once that dependency changes, we can safely remove that. And that creates like an extra level of guardrail, and we're kind of working towards essentially creating a full lineage of things that depend on DBT from DBT downstream. And then what's next? So building a generic exposure generator for sources beyond mode. So I think Census is one of the things we'll start building, but we're also going to build more. If you have ideas, thoughts, feedback around this, please find me either in the Slack. Later on, we're trying to explore running DBT modeling on staging data, especially from our platform team that owns the front-end app for Vouch, and kind of catch issues around consuming their data earlier. The next thing we're also like trying really hard to do is get to a point where we can automatically drop tables that are no longer part of the DBT graph. Because right now that is manual and that's error prone, and we've run into quite a few issues where customers will tell us like, but basically other people within Vouch will tell us like, yeah, I was using this table, but it no longer exists, right? Or the data is pretty stale, and we kind of want to avoid those issues. And there's of course more. So thank you. I think that was it. Sorry, it ran a bit long. Happy to take questions either here or in the Slack later on. And as usual, we're hiring for data specifically. I think we're hiring an analyst position. So if you know anyone, send them my way. All right, thank you.
And is that, are you hiring for like a entry-level analyst, or what's that position?
I think probably mid-career level. So like, okay. Not entry level, but we can work around like senior, mid-level, somewhere there. Yeah.
Gotcha. Good to know. And there were a few questions. I will bring them onto the screen. First one from Josh Gallant. How do you make sure you're being informed for intersystem changes? Example, new value added in a Salesforce column that is part of a case statement in a DBT transform. This may not want to be defaulted with the else value.
Okay, inform for intersystem changes. We don't have a very good process around this, to be quite honest with you. Like it's a lot of times the data comes in and we kind of like react to it. We want to be better at it. And I think a lot of that is just like having your teams that live in these tools like Salesforce and all, having them sort of like pushing them to standardize what the accepted value should be and kind of like relying on them. But at the same time, we haven't really pushed too hard on this because it's a fairly easy fix for us to do. So, yeah. So that's kind of the answer to that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. If you wanted to expand on that, no problem.
No, I think that was about it. I can chat more later, but yeah.
Perfect. And the next one from one of our previous speakers, Carlos Calisi. Have you run into problems when using SQL Fluff on a DBT project, meaning SQL Fluff acting up when scanning Jinja snippets?
We used to, we don't anymore. Upgrade SQL Fluff. 1.0 is great. So that's kind of the thing I'll have there. It does act up a bit when you have like really complicated Jinja, but the newer versions are way better at DBT and Jinja parsing than they used to be. So
And Josh Gallant again asked, can we get a link to your DBT YAML check?
yeah,
I just looked for it. Didn't want to add the wrong link.
Yeah, so I guess
And you can add that in the Slack if you want.
yeah, I think it's here. So let me just copy this link.
Oh, perfect.
And I can put it in the chat here. Yep, there you go.
And last question is from me. How long did it take you to build this DBT YAML check?
A couple of days, but it's not that hard because you're just like, once you have your manifest and your catalog, it's just comparing between those two. So not that hard to build with some basic software engineering, but there are a lot of things that kind of like I missed because when you run catalog in CI, it only builds it only scans whatever has changed, and so like it's not your full project, and so there's kind of a V2 of that coming out probably sometime. So
And do you feel the weight of responsibility having this like this Git repository that people use? Are you scared like, oh no, there's going to be a bug and they're going to freak out at me?
no, because it's fairly simple. Like it's maybe like 100 lines, but yeah, the famous soon release date promises. Maybe not for this one, but I think the last slide, which is like this one, the generic exposures, the first one, it should be out by Coalesce. I'll say that.
Oh, awesome. That's great. Okay. Kadish, thank you so much for this session. Again, like you said, if you guys have any more questions for him, join the Operational Analytics Club and he'll answer any questions there. So thank you very much. And next up, we have Matthew Brandt in about 1 minute. So I'll see you guys soon.